Okay, folks, well, good afternoon and welcome to another one of our TESS seminars. TESS, of course, being our Center for Tropical Environmental and Sustainability Science. We're going to start today with 1 minute of silence, grieving over the US election results. Okay, that was a short minute. Anyway, I hope you're all feeling better than I am right now, but life is life. It's a real pleasure to introduce Luciano Naka, who's visiting here from Argentina. Well, he's originally from Argentina, now I guess Brazil, US, Brazil, where's your home base now?
Brazil.
In Brazil, yeah. Okay, right. Anyway, Luciano, we've known Luciano for a long time, since going back to our days in Brazil in the late 1990s. Luciano did his PhD at Louisiana State University, which is a very good university in the US, studying the distributional ecology of canopy birds and fragmented landscapes or something like that. Would that be fair?
That was my master's.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, well, anyway, okay.
I'll talk about this.
Okay, he'll talk about that. All right. So anyway, Luciano did his undergraduate work in Brazil. He did his master's degree at IMPA, which is Brazil's National Institute for Amazonian Research. He did his PhD at Louisiana State, and he's published a lot in the field of avian biogeography and conservation and ecology in South America. And we're very happy to have Luciano with us today. Thanks, Luciano.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm sorry to have to share my day with some appealing news, but so I'll try to cheer you up a little bit, at least the American parts of people here. So today I'm gonna first I would like to thank Bill and for having me here, not only for inviting me for this seminar, but also for having me here in Australia. And also I'd like to thank Lisa and John, who've been instrumental in having me pull from Brazil and arriving here for a few months. And then last but not least, I would like to thank Annabelle, who's been my guardian angel from stuff related to visa bureaucracy to treatment of 3 sting trees that I just got. So she's been helping me throughout the way. So I decided to, when I was invited to give a talk, I decided to present to you one that is take some of the most interesting things that I can think of, which is diversity and speciation in neotropical birds, or how the South American avifauna came to be. So this actually is a book chapter that we have been published 2023. It's not yet out there yet, but that was it's a book chapter we wrote with my friends and colleagues Santiago Claramunt and my grad student, Victor Leandro Silva. So many of the things that I'm going to talk today are gonna be there and you can read them as soon as it comes out. So the question of why South America has such a diverse and unique avifauna has been a main question since Humboldt, Darwin, and Wallace visited the South American continent during the 1700s, 1800s, and late 1800s here. And so the question, I don't know why it's going too fast, but so this, maybe the first hint of why is South American so special comes from one of the writings of Wallace in 1876, where he mentioned that richness combined with isolation is the predominant feature of neotropical zoology, and no other region can approach it in the number of its peculiar family and generic types. So I need to remember that Wallace spent 4 years in the Amazon, and then he spent another 8 years in the Malay archipelago. So he knew a little bit of biogeography. And actually the only place on earth that can match this number of peculiar forms families is Australia. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here. So I will talk today, I tried to organize the talk in the following order. So first I will try to convince you that South America is the bird continent. This is usually very easy to do with a North American or European audience. Australians are gonna be a little bit icy about this. I will talk about this soon. Then I will just present some historical landmarks that define current avian diversity as we know it today in South America. Then I will present a little very brief history of South American birds since the Cenozoic. And I will present, for those of you that don't know, that are not familiar with South American landscapes, a little bit of the diversity of biomes, ecosystems, and habitats that we have in the continent. And finally, we'll go to the most interesting part of this for me, which is the patterns of diversity and speciation in South American birds, where I'll try to include some of the stuff I've been doing the last 15, 20 years. So I think South America, we can call it the land of birds. Its avian diversity and endemisms is highly disproportional to its size. So you probably know Wallace set up some geographical realms 150 years ago, where he divided the world according to different zoological groups. We have different, some newer versions with different methods, but those biogeographic realms are holding there. So I decided I'm using this map just to compare a little bit. It's going to be a brief comparison between the Neotropics and South America, in particular with the other biogeographical regions. So just for some numbers that you need to remember, there are about 10,000 species of birds. So what I'm saying, that's Neotropicals. The Neotropics, which includes all of the South American continent and part of Central America and the Caribbean, and a little tiny bit of Trump, Florida. So there is the Neotropics has about 45% of all the species in the world. From the 250 families of birds, the Neotropics has about 126, so half of them. And I created this little math here, little rate of species per million hectares. So it's about 225 species per million hectares. We'll talk about that later. So having 19 million square kilometers, that means 13% of the Earthland. We have about 40% of the world birds, 80% of which are endemic. So of course, the Neotropical region is more than South America, but I think there are good reasons to treat South America as a unit, good historical reasons. So just for the sake of our math here, Central America and the Caribbean are pretty amazing places for biogeography and species diversity. And you can see that the number of species per unit area skyrockets like an order of magnitude above South America. However, when we're talking about South America itself, without the rest of the Neotropics, we're talking about 3,400 species, 80% of which are endemic, 100 families, 25 of which only occur in South America. And this ratio is 191 species, or let's say nearly 200 per square kilometer. So 80% of the species that occur in South America are unique to the continent, and 75%, I mean that 80% of the species in the Neotropics occur in South America, and 75% of the endemisms comes from the South American continent. So when we're trying to compare how South America fares against other biogeographical realms, we start with the Nearctic. This is a pretty unfair comparison. It's 3 times more species, same amount of families, but 0 endemic families in the Nearctic. Is quite pathetic here. And this gets even worse when you go to the Palearctic, just like 27 species per 100 per million square kilometers. So this silly comparison. Things start to get a bit more interesting when we compare South America with the Afrotropics, for example. So here, if we compare numbers, South America still, he's trying to have me speaking very quickly. So when we compare species richness, the Afrotropics is larger than South America. So we still have fewer species, fewer endemic families, yet it's starting to get level of endemisms in the Afrotropics is quite high, 75% of the species, 50% of the families. That's getting interesting. And of course, maybe the most reasonable comparison is against Australasia, which includes Australia, and you can see Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, and the numbers are pretty staggering. So you see, although it's much smaller, half of the area of South America, we still have like almost 2,000 species, 73% of which are endemic, 119 families. So I have more endemic families in Australasia than in South America. So, and the number the ratio of species per area is higher in Australasia. So there are some reasons for how these 2 regions compare. And I would like to talk about those to you. But there's reasons also why we have many more species, and we'll talk about that later. So why South America have we found it so diverse and unique? Well, there are both historical and ecological reasons. I'll say that the historical reasons talk about how lineages form and diversify through time, and how there's opportunities of the formation of new species, whereas ecological reasons, they will let us understand how species persist and distribute across the landscape, allowing ecological specialization, niche partitioning, and species coexistence. So I'm gonna just make a little brief history of South America. And I wanna present to you 4 main historical landmarks which define the South American avifauna today. The first of them is that South America was an island continent, an isolated island continent for about 40 million years, pretty much what Australia endured and it still endures today. So if we see here, that's where the first, what we consider the first bird Archaeopteryx was formed, appeared. So 150 years ago, this was Earth look like. And you can see 100 years already, South America separating from North America, starting to separate from Africa, still having a connection 80 million years ago with, Gondwana, with Antarctica and Australia, but already cutting their ties with North America and Africa, and starting to break this connection with Antarctica about 50 million years ago, and then roam by itself South America for about quite a few years until very recently, when South America encountered North America again through the formation of the Isthmus of Panama about 3 and 8 million years ago. So this was an important part of this endemism that South America has a lot to do with this time in isolation. The second important landmark is the uprise of the Andes. So the uprise of the Andes started to go up about 50 million years ago, slowly, but really took off about 26 million years ago. And it got even some parts of the Andes are still rising, but this is where most of the Andes, when most of the Andes got up. And of course, the rise of the Andes not only was responsible for having new habitats, but also for reconfiguring the entire South American continent. So the Amazon basin would not be possible without having the Andes reorganizing the entire basin towards the Atlantic. And then we have, of course, the build of the Panama Isthmus, which connected finally South America with Central America and North America, of course, and that had important implications for the entire avifauna. Okay, this is which is called the Great American Biological Interchange. It was very famous for mammals, with the studies on birds starting to be better understood. But we know, for example, that many of the groups that arrived in South America arrived during this period. And finally, we got the climatic changes during the Pleistocene that, of course, shaped South America in different ways, not as strongly as in North America or like Northern Europe, but it was important in many aspects. We're going to be talking about that later. And then I would like to make a brief history of South American birds. First, we need to remember that the first lineages, of birds appeared in the late Jurassic, about 150 years ago with Archaeopteryx. And then we need to know that every bird that we have today comes from one single clade, is the Neornithis. All the other birds went extinct. And I divided the history of South America in three periods. First of all, I'm presenting here some of the lineages that were present during the Paleogene. So we know that they were there, either originated or arrived in South America a long time ago. Then we have a group of animals, of families that arrived during the Neogene, the last 23 million years. And then we have relatively recent in situ speciation. And most of every evolutionary model you heard about, like the riverine barrier hypothesis or the refugia, applies to these birds during the last few million years. So there are at least 10 extant avian orders that were in South America from the last 50 million years. So we know that there were rheas there. We know that the tinamous were in South America, the same of the ducks, the plovers, the penguins, we got the petrels and albatrosses, the seriemas, the falconids, the parrots, and most importantly, the passeriformes, which is the passerine birds, which contain a large amount of the birds. So these birds were in South America, been in South America for quite a long time. And it's quite important, this relationship here, this clade, which includes the passeriformes, the passerine birds or the sunbirds, so then its closest relatives, the parrots and the falcons and the seriemas, were obviously had a Gondwanan origin. And when we're talking about the passerines, this is particularly important because 65% of all bird species are passerine birds. Okay, so here we have a little phylogeny of the passerine birds. And we are pretty, I mean, the literature is pretty clear now that they have a Gondwanan origin. In fact, the first lineage split from the rest of the passerines 56 million years ago, and those are the New Zealand wrens, 2 species alive in New Zealand today, 2 species gone, extinct recently. And then we have the second main lineage, which are the subocines, the passerine subocines, with 1,300 species, which split from the rest by about 40 million years ago. And here we have some of the main groups for South American birds, which are the Tyrannides, which includes some of the birds that you might have heard of, like the ovenbirds, the cotingas, the manakins, the tapaculos, the antbirds. All these come from the subocene passerines. So those species apparently either originated in South America, I mean, either somewhere in Gondwana, either Australia or South America. And then we have most of the passerines are oscines. The oscines developed in the northern hemisphere and all the old world. Although the first lineages seem to be, so the origin of these oscines seems to be Australian, because most of the basal groups are from Australia, including the lyrebird. And then you have a little group of oscines that exploded in South America. So those arrived through North America, and we have like the 9 primary oscines, which are a special group that has about 400 species, and other groups that arrived in South America, you know, the jays, the wrens, the mockingbirds, the thrushes that arrived through the Panama Bridge. Okay. So then we have species that arrived more recently during the Neogene. So one of the cases is the hoatzin. That's been a weird case for many years. Nobody knew where it was coming from. But then a fossil from Africa was found. And apparently it came rowing or on some vegetation on a raft many million years ago. And the same might have happened with one particular group, the Donacobidae, whose closest is an endemic South American family, whose closest relative birds are from Africa. And that happened before any connection was established. So it seems that there was some connection. You know, we have this case of like the New World primates apparently came from Africa, the same with the New World rodents during, you know, between 30 and 40 million years ago. So it seems that this pattern of having some rafting creatures arriving from Africa was occurred many times. And then we get the birds that arrive from South America. So basically every oscine passerine that is in South America today has arrived through North America during the Great American Biological Interchange. And that includes 830 species of oscines and some non-passerines. So we had birds that arrived before the actual connection was built up between Panama and South America. So we got the swallows, we got the tanagers, we got the thrushes that seems to have arrived about 12 million years ago. Then we got some species like the wrens and the blackbirds, South American blackbirds that arrived about 8 million years ago. And then we have the mockingbirds and the woodpeckers that arrived from North America as well. And some birds seem to have arrived actually walking through the bridge. So like the crassidae, the guans and the mudmods have probably not been able to cross before the actual build of the bridge. So now changing gears, I would just like to present some of this diversity of South America, especially for those of you who have not been to South America at all. As you can see, the biomes, the colors of South America is very complex. So it's one of the continents with the most number of biomes in the continent. And of course, the biome diversity has a lot to do with sea currents and the atmospheric circulation models, which define where you will have tropical forests, where you have deserts, and that's the case, for example, for all the west coast of South America, the west coast of Africa, and the west coast of Australia, which have cold waters and have deserts, whereas the east coast have warm waters and have tropical forests, as we have right here in the wet tropics. And of course, the currents itself is not the whole story. The atmospheric circulation models is what takes the humidity from the land and takes it, sends it. So there's a very clear pattern about 30 degrees, which crashes right in Australia, where this humid, the warm and humid air is gone, goes up, and then is taken to other areas, tropical areas. So it makes this 30 degrees latitude even more dry. We have, with that in mind, so here we have South America, and I want to color this map with you, just trying to understand how these biomes in South America relate to one another. So the first thing that we need to understand South America, we need to understand the Andes. So the Andes is by far the largest mountain chain. So it's about 9,000 kilometers, can reach up to 7 kilometers high in some regions, and is the backbone of South America. And is virtually covering every latitude from 54 degrees south to 11 degrees north. So it's covering the entire range of climates that you could imagine. And quite surprisingly, it's one of the only cordilleras that runs crossing latitude. Most of the other cordilleras like the Himalayas or the Alps are all east to west. Here we have Australia, which is the same, but of course is a much lower latitudinal gradient and much lower mountains, of course. So when we talk about the Andes, which kind of habitats we have along the Andes? Well, we can divide the Andes in at least 3 different groups. We have the Austral Andes, which look a lot, this beech forest that you might have seen similarly in New Zealand. You have the subtropical Andes, which are the youngest in northern Argentina, southern Bolivia. And you have the tropical Andes, which have several different habitats, depending on the altitude. So you have mountain forest, cloud forest higher up, elfin forest, and you have paramo forest higher up, about 3,000 meters. And of course, each one of these habitats will have specialized bird species, right? So here we are starting to understand why there are so many species in South America, because there is a lot of habitats to be occupied by birds. Then, of course, we cannot talk about South America without talking about the Amazon, which is actually the only place on Earth where you have this huge mountain range juxtaposed, just joined by the largest tropical forest that we know. And of course, there's 2 other wet forests in South America that take this humidity from the water, which are the Atlantic forest and the Chocó in Western Colombia and Ecuador, which are both of them full of endemics, very diverse avifaunas. We also have 4 main wetlands in South America. We have the Pantanal, many people know. We have the Beni, which is kind of similar to the Pantanal. We have the Amazonian floodplains, and we have the Llanos. Each one of these these ecosystems will have specialized birds. And then we have one of the things that topics I've been studying the most recently, which is the dry diagonal. This is the South American dry diagonal, which is composed of 3 different biomes. One is the Chaco, the dry Chaco, you have the savannas called the cerrados in central Brazil, and then you have the Caatinga dry forest, which is where I'll be presenting some data later on along the talk. And then we have the arid diagonal. So we have a dry diagonal and arid diagonal crisscrossing the continent, which includes some very specific, very characteristic landscapes here, which they look pretty much like this. And some of you might be familiar with these environments. But pretty much what's interesting is usually when we think about South America, we think about the tropics and green and luxuriant. Well, half of the continent is actually built up of open formations with special birds everywhere. So I could pick each one of these different ecosystems and show you a list of endemic birds and specialized species. And then just to finish up coloring this, we have two of the habitats that have been most destroyed by human beings, like the wet Chaco and the Pampas, which has been mostly converted into pasture lands and croplands, which are unfortunately almost gone. Right, so this is a map we built with using 3,400, all the bird species known in South America, and we can see the patterns of distribution. So you see the more red, the more species that we have in the maps, and you can see that avian diversity is spatially heterogeneous. So some regions, of course, has more species than others, and we can pin out some particular areas. So like the eastern slope of the Andes are particularly rich. The Amazon in general, the Atlantic forests, and the northern Amazon, the region of the Tepuy, some of the mountains. I think we have a couple of slides later. And then you have the isolated mountain chains like Santa Marta, Perijá, and Cordillera de la Costa in Venezuela, which are especially diverse in terms of species and endemisms. How can we explain these diversity patterns? Well, it's mostly they correlate well with current climatic factors. So temperature and precipitation do the trick. Warmer areas, which are more humid, will have more bird species. Which this comes to the energy richness hypothesis, which is the idea that more productive areas can sustain more species. And we have ample evidence of this. Although theory should suggest that more productive areas should have more individuals, not necessarily more species. So we're going to see how this works out. So how do you actually put more species in the same space? How do you actually staff them? One of the ways of doing that is through niche packing. So you actually, each one of the species will have a narrower niche and more specific habitats to use. So to test this hypothesis, we've been studying environmental gradients along the Rio Branco in the northern Amazon, which includes some of the there's the Brazilian state of Roraima, which has a very clear rainfall and productivity pattern. This is a map from Terstiges showing dry seasonal length. And if you go to the area where I was showing you, here you can see that is the most colorful throughout the Amazon. So you have a gradient of rainfall along this river. So we've been trying to understand how the bird fauna will change from this here, which rains about 1,100 millimeters, 1,500 millimeters to 3 meters a year. So we sampled this river, studying riparian birds in different localities. So we did point counts, and we end up with about 450 censuses along the entire length of the river. And what we found is that, of course, there is a gradient of species composition. So you have some species on the upper Rio Branco, which you don't have on the lower Rio Branco. And there's replacements. And this gradient correlates well with the climate. So what we found, evidence of this energy richness hypothesis, that rainier and more productive areas will have higher species richness, although, and quite surprisingly, had the same amount of individuals. So then we were searching for evidence of species packing. How can I actually have so many more species? And we found that species there actually have a smaller biomass, so smaller species and less abundant birds will be there. So that will how you make up of having more species in the same area. Another way to put more species in one region is to have more stratification. So you have more strata along in a tropical forest. And this is what I did so I was studying during my master's, I was studying canopy birds in the Amazon. So during my PhD, we compared my data from the Amazon with the data of another friend of mine, David Anderson, and we compare how the Amazon fared against Honduran's canopy. And what we found is that the Amazon had actually higher species richness in the canopy, had more stratification and more specialized birds, and had more rare and few dominant species. So that's how, even in the Amazon, we're managing to have more species. And of course, another way to have more species is, and this is related to the niches, is to have more specialization. So you have the restricted use of habitats and microhabitats, specialized resources, and some unique behaviors that you don't see elsewhere. So one of the cases I want to bring to you is, for example, the genus Epinecrophila, or small ant wrens that are dead leaf specialists. So you will only find these birds in the Amazon where you have dead leaves hanging from trees. And you don't have only one species. Actually, you have 8 species of these dead leaf specialists. So the same happens with obligate army ants, army ant followers. So you have about 10 species of birds that will follow army ants for their lives. They will disappear if you take away the army ants, as studies I'm shown from Bill and Susan. And this clade apparently is very old. This comes from the Miocene. And so these birds have been following ants for quite many years. And then you have unique behaviors, like, for example, the point-tailed pond creeper that is a bird only found in Buriti palms. So one species of palm, you will have the bird there. So you have many examples of this. So this adds to the diversity of species in South America. Another issue that adds species is specialization on Amazonian rivers. So we've been working on flooded forest birds. And as you might know, the Amazon has several different colors of rivers. So we can divide the rivers in black water rivers, white water rivers, and clear water rivers. The white water are not rafting rivers, but rather like muddy rivers. And there is a relationship between species and these colors of the river. Of course, the color is not itself what's defining this, but it's a function of the sedimentation, pH, nutrients, etc. So we've been showing that rivers with different colors have different avifaunas. And this is particularly clear when you compare, when you go after flooded forest specialists. So many of the birds that are like common birds, they will be in all sorts of different colors of rivers, but the special ones actually are choosing their habitats. And this relates to the concentration of sediments in the river. Another topic that I've been working in the past decade or so is how micro changes in the landscape actually affect the distribution of birds. So within a homogeneous tropical forest, like a terra firma forest that never floods, so you have little variation in little, like a 50-meter difference in the forest can have a very big effect on the birds that are roaming around the trees. So we have done work at Duque Reserve. This is what with my ex-advisor and ex-student of John. And we have shown that, for example, species respond well to this microtopographic environmental gradient, and altitude, distance to the creeks, and litter depth actually define which species occur where. And we're doing the same now in one of our altar sites in the Amazon, where we're doing this in 2 different sites in the place I showed you before. There was the same river I mentioned before in Roraima, the Rio Branco. So we have 2 stations where we have 5 by 5 kilometer grids, and we have 30 permanent plots in each one of those. And the data is quite interesting. So we see that birds, avian composition, respond not only to these variables, but also to tree composition. So we have trees, we have tree composition in each one of these plots. We have birds are affected by a small variation in altitude, sometimes 20, 30 meters of altitude. The clay content defines avian composition in these regions, soil micronutrients. So it's pretty incredible how small micro differences in a tropical forest can actually have different, forced to have different avifaunas in such a small scale. And we are now expanding this into the Caatinga dry forest. So this is northern South America, I mean, the tip of South America. This is where I teach here, Recife, where I live. And this is, so we're including now about 10 sites. We're gonna be doing, we're starting now, permanent plots. We're gonna be studying these ecological determinants of the biota, not only of birds, but of different groups, including mammals, reptiles, non-avian reptiles, frogs, and a bunch of insect groups. Okay, and now the final part of the talk is about patterns of avian diversity. And the question is, does the vastness of South American landscapes guarantee more species? Or just we have, I hear a little hit here. Oh, it's my water. Just breathing. Okay. So how, my question is here, because we have a huge tropical forest, the Amazon, that means we have to have more species. Because the mountains are so huge, do you have to have more species or just more individuals? Well, the thing is that these huge landscapes actually offer more heterogeneity. So we know that the Amazon is not, a green carpet of forest, but is drained by massive rivers, which creates these floodplains. And of course, the floodplains will have different species from the terra firma. We show that not only the floodplains avifauna is different from the terra firma, but within the terra firma, you have differences with small scale changes. So also in the Amazon, you have these enclaves of open vegetation. So this is savanna right here in northern Amazonia. So when rain less, you have savannas replacing the forest, and of course you have different birds in these savannas. You have the tepuis, which I mentioned before, these 3,000-meter high mountains in the middle of the Amazon, just incredible places full of endemisms and biodiversity. So actually, when we're talking about this huge forest, well, a lot of it comes from this heterogeneity that is coming. And this heterogeneity allows also some isolation and subsequent speciation. So we have rivers, you have river valleys, you have isolated mountain chains, you have altitudinal stratification like in the Andes, you have ecotones. So all this is adding up to this species diversity in South America. So there were some biogeographical models of speciation in South America, some of them brought up by Humboldt, but some special case is about Frank Chapman, who was the curator of the American Museum during the 1900s. And he was like one of the first biogeographers. He has these two books that he published. One is about the distribution of bird life in Colombia and the other one in Ecuador. And here he put forward some of the hypotheses we're still testing today. So one of the things is he mentioned the importance of the Andes as a vicariant barrier. So he mentioned that there was probably a pre-Andean fauna that was separated by the rise of the Andes. So that was his idea. People are today testing this hypothesis with the genomic methods, molecular methods. He even gave the list of groups. You see, they have this Eastern and Cis and Trans-Andean populations. Go and sequence it. Then he mentioned that the Andes uprise, the uprise of the Andes, not only offer novel habitats, but gave origin to different species through parapathic speciation and local adaptation. So there is some very nice studies of Dr. Terborg testing competition and replacement along these gradients. So that was some of the ideas that he brought. And he mentioned that the higher areas, like the Paramos, about 3,000 meters, will be colonized by temperate lineages. So basically, he will say that Patagonian staff will actually go and colonize colder areas in the tropical mountains. So some of these hypotheses fare very well with molecular data, some of them not so good, but he set up like years of research back in the 1900s. And one final thing that he envisioned was patterns of speciation along the Andes. So there are many valleys along the Andes here, and sure enough, I don't know if this is painful, okay, here, here, and sure enough, people are finding replacement populations across these valleys. So you go at 3,000 meters, it goes down to 700, goes up to 3,000, and of course, birds cannot cross that. So you have speciation in movement there. So the work of Frank Chapman has been, his enduring ideas took over 100 years of still testing his hypothesis. A similar case came to, so I'm talking about the Andes and now about the Amazon, was about the works of Wallace and probably Jürgen Hafer, which is one of the most famous and maybe greatest biogeographers that stepped on the Amazon. So Wallace mentioned that during his residence in the Amazon, he found that the Amazon, the Negro, and Madeira rivers formed the limits beyond which certain species never passed. So basically, this was at the talk at the Zoological Society in London in 1852, after he came after his 4-year trip to the Amazon. And this set up the idea basically that you have Amazonian rivers separate different pairs of taxa, some of which are different species, some of which are different subspecies. So this is a picture of the Rio Negro here. So basically it works as you have closely related taxa, a little different, but closely related, that separate across Amazonian rivers. And this is what I did for my PhD. This pattern of having rivers separating different taxa is known from Africa, some groups, is known for the Mississippi, but the scale that we see in South America is unheard of. I mean, we're talking about several, a dozen large rivers that separate different species of birds. And we're talking about hundreds of species of birds divided by rivers. So here you have one species pump. Why we have so many? Why we have 8 species of deadleaf and wrens? Well, some of them are separated. Most of them are separated by this interfluvia. So this is how it works. You have different species, closely related, obviously related, across different rivers, and we see this in mammals as well. And basically, these patterns of distribution was what Hafer was studying. And well, the definition of areas of endemism basically just mirror these large interfluvia. And the idea came that, the rivers might have been important in the speciation process, given that they separate current diversity. So maybe rivers were the vicariant force dividing these many species. So the idea is quite simple. You have one ancestral population, you get a river crossing it, and then you get one population that gets a red head, the other one gets a yellow head, and evolution goes on. So this idea has been tested several times, the river that came known as the river in Barry hypothesis, which is a hypothesis that is very tough to point down to who actually mentioned it. So Wallace, he came with the idea of river separating species of monkeys in 1852. We had to wait another 100 years to actually somebody, which was Helmut Sick, was a German ornithologist that lived in Brazil since the Second World War. And he had this little symposium paper, like nobody has, which he suggests that actually rivers were important in dividing ancestral populations. Then I had to wait another 20 years till Angelo Caporella actually put some genomes, some genes into this situation, showing different genetic differences across the rivers. But of course, the river in Barry hypothesis has its nemesis. Jürgen Hafer hated this idea. He knew the distribution of birds in South America very well. He has these maps that he will carry. We don't have like internet or computers or eBird. So he had these handmade maps. And he was very well aware that rivers were separating species, different taxa. But throughout his career, he just hammered this idea that rivers were important. So not important, but were the cause of speciation. So he mentioned that possibly this difference disappears gradually towards the headwaters, which then cease to be barriers. So basically he had the river headwaters would work as contact zones, and rivers were important, of course, but only as secondary barriers. So this was something that I did. This was the topic of my PhD. So I was studying pairs of taxa. Here we have two different races of the white plume amber. One has a little eyebrow, the other one doesn't. So I mapped the distribution of these things. And I basically went after about 80 of these pairs of taxa, which I sequenced, I collected, and was trying to understand where these things were being divided. You see a yellow crest, a brown crest, different colors of the bud, different little small differences. So then I study the physical barriers and the location of these suture zones. And what I found, of course, that the rivers were important as phylogenetic breaks, and as Haffer suggested, that the headwaters of the rivers were important contact zones, where you have hybrids and some of these forms actually meet on the headwaters. And then I came into the idea of testing the difference between being a primary or a secondary barrier. Primary barrier being the barrier that actually divided ancestral populations. Secondary barrier is a barrier that was there before the actual being an important barrier. So it holds secondary contact. So I did that was the last chapter of my PhD, where I tested whether Amazonian rivers were primary or secondary barriers. And well, this is what I tested divergence times in about 80 pairs of avian taxa. And what I found is that the time since isolation for each one of these pairs goes pretty much uninterrupted, from like very recent, like 0.7, like 70,000 years ago, to all the way to 8 million years ago. So each pair seems to have its own age. And if we put up, for example, the age of the Rio Negro here, well, it can explain these guys maybe, but it's not going to explain all these other species. So it looks like these riverine barriers are, the time estimates are not consistent with any one particular river. So this came to the idea that it's very difficult to actually find a single model to explain all the speciation that occur in the Amazon. A careful analysis suggests that the origin of extant neotropical diversity cannot be attributed to the action of one or a few events during key time intervals. And I stand to those words by rule, and I think it's a very important message. So it seems to each lineage is telling its own story. So it's very difficult to have this great hypothesis that can explain one group. But then if you, for example, this map of South America was made from this group, but if you take other species of the trumpeters, these guys here, well, the order of subdivision within the Amazon is just different. So it seems that we have to take into account much more things that we're not doing it yet, such as dispersal capacity, for example. And of course, Haffer had its own little theory, and he came up with the Pleistocene refugia, which is a highly popular hypothesis since its invention in the science paper 69, all the way to the 90s. So it went through, first accepted from very different groups. It started with birds, then it came to butterflies and plants, and then it started to take over the world. So people finding in the Western Ghats, people in North America, Australia. So the idea of the refugia was great. So I don't want to get into the idea of the refugia now, but it's basically you have a uniform area, then humidity, times of humidity and dry periods, glacial periods, actually divided and transformed this homogeneous forest into little refugia, where you had species will be in there and will speciate, and then when the new humidity came back, they will no longer recognize each other. It's a very nice hypothesis, but it failed soon after people started checking out that there's any evidence that the Amazon actually got into the process of savanization, and there's refugia actually existed. However, in recent studies, and I'm almost done here, sorry for the time. So we have shown that Pleistocene landscapes actually change in recent times, and that has affected maybe not these terraformivorous birds that is what Haffer used for his hypothesis, but it actually affected the distribution and diversification of some varsia birds. So we see that all this, we've done this along the same river I was talking about, and now we found that Pleistocene climate change has probably separated and created the opportunity of speciation within flooded forest species. And then when we think about speciation, usually we think about the Amazon or the Andes, but what about outside of the Amazon? So there was one other hypothesis that came just to complement Haffer's ideas and was in '93, so it was at the high rise of the refugia, the Pleistocenic refugia, which is the Pleistocenic arc hypothesis, which is here to explain the distribution of non-Amazonian species along dry forests. So we have here the dry diagonals I mentioned before. These are all different parts of dry forests or open landscapes. And this hypothesis suggests that these were continuous at one time some years ago. So this Pleistocene arc hypothesis, we tested using molecular data on different groups, and we seem to be supporting this idea that maybe not in the LG, and it wasn't the last glacial maxima that occurred like 21,000 years ago, but during the Pleistocene, we had these environmental exchanges along ecotones, and dry forests actually seem to have isolated in patches and cause at least some initial stages of speciation. And we found through modeling that there was high probability of connectivity during glacial periods and isolation during interglacials, such as we are right now. So we are studying now this whole genome data for one bird that occurs throughout the dry diagonal, and well, this is in the works, but we are seeing evidence of this Pleistocenic arc hypothesis, not in the way that it was envisioned originally, that was like 20,000 years ago, but it seems to have affected these tropical dry forests. And we have evidence of of trees, this is a map of lizards, for example, of this pattern of having some different dry forests sharing similar lineages. So this is a case, the Marmorchus trigillatus, the white, I think it's stripe-backed antbird, has a population in the Caatinga dry forest here and in the Chaco. So this was actually, so you can see the two habitats. This is the Caatinga, this is the Chaco, pretty similar, looks like the same road, but it's not. And we've been working on these several pairs of species that do have the same general pattern. Have a Caatinga specialist, and then you have one other species back in the Chaco. Again, a little bit similar, yet different populations. And we're trying to ask, so we're using genomic data to address three questions. Is there a genomic structure in these isolated populations? Is there gene flow today? And when have these populations diverged, if they have? And what we're finding, again, is that, well, looks like in every case we have been studying, there is genomic structure, things are different, there is very limited or no gene flow whatsoever, and the time of divergence has varied according to the species. So for example, for the troupials here, the last time these two guys shared genes was about 1 million years ago, right? When we check when these two populations divided, well, it was more recent, like 0.6 million years ago. And we're doing this over and over again with different species. And what we see is the general question is there is genomic structure in every population that you have different species or different subspecies or different populations. There is a genetic divide. And in most of the cases, there's no any sign of current gene flow. So that happened in the past. And the times of divergence diverges. So diverge within species. So we're coming back to the same idea that we are finding in the Amazon, where each species each lineage seems to be having its own story. So there is no evidence of common diversification, but this is, of Of course, something is in the works. We have the genomic data already ready for those. It's in the computer, which is going to be out in the next few months, years, decades. So just to take our final considerations, I just think South America, I think is the land of birds. Australia could have been, only if you have had like huge cordillera in the middle, going up the way to 7,000 meters. So you can keep on trying, but you did very well for what you have. I think it's really the second most exciting place on earth to study birds is South America and Australia. But this might happen into other groups. I mean, it's not only the land of birds, it's the land of rodents, it's the land of insects, it's the land of, you call it, of bats. But it's very important that we understand the continent as a unit. So that's, I mean, if we go studying little bird in the Amazon, well, or in the Caatinga here, okay, let's go from here all the way up. Just from here, well, it doesn't matter if we don't go all the way trying to understand these relationships. And it seems that single evolutionary models have fared poorly across the test of time. So it looks like we don't have this general hypothesis that can explain everything. Unfortunately, they would be having nice, but we don't have it. And it seems that many of the questions that are posed by Humboldt, Darwin, and Wallace remain to be answered. So just get out in the field. And finally, I have a final consideration, which is kind of surprising for me. So 13% of the world area, yet we have the 3 best soccer players in the history of humanity. So with this, in that order, of course, first Messi, Maradona, and sorry for my Brazilian friend here, Pelé. So thank you very much. I'll be open to questions.
Good. Okay. So folks have some opportunity for questions, including online. Very interesting talk, by the way. I really enjoyed that talk. Online?
Yeah, question.
Okay.
Oh, do I do something here? Yeah, press.
No, does he press anything? Oh, he does.
Duplicate
Okay.
on both. I was trained. Annabelle.
So are we all good? Who's asked? Well, in the interim, is there anybody here who wants to ask a question? I'll ask a question. Oh, go ahead, Dennis. Yeah.
Speciation and splitting. I just wondered what your views are, because we know speciations occur naturally, but also not splitting species. And I've been to South America a few times. I'm very guy. And so when you actually have that on the east and west side, and we know that you said that very interesting as well. To what extent is that speciation accelerating thing as a result of splitting? In other words, that idea before happening in evolutionary time scale, of course, accelerating through those differentiations, markings and so on. To what extent now is that kind of being challenged by the fact that we can keep into the DNA of the bird, like deciding that subspecies is not a second species?
Yeah, well, I actually, all throughout my career, I have not actually paid too much attention of whether a pair of lineage was a different species or different subspecies. So for example, at this study I done for my PhD, I had 80 pairs of taxa. Some of them were species, some of them were subspecies, and it didn't make much of a difference for me. The process, the speciation process, we know, it's just like a continuum, so we could draw a line whenever we want. But I don't think for the speciation process, I mean, where we actually draw the line, I don't think it actually matters whether you and me and you and I, we consider it's a different species or now it's diverged or not. And actually those numbers of time since divergence that I presented are quite clear. So you have some, pairs of taxa that are obviously different. Some they're split a little time ago, 70,000 years, some 8 million years. Whether they have to be a species or subspecies, I don't know. I mean, that's important for us going and checking it, but maybe not for the speciation process, I don't think it actually matters. It shows that it's a continuum, and we are seeing this, I mean, evolution happening as we speak.
Other questions?
Yeah,
Sue?
Bill, it's Penny here. How are you going? Thank you.
Go
Can you
ahead.
hear me?
Yes.
Look,
Yes.
that was a terrific talk. I just wondered about the Australasian region. It doesn't, I know, it doesn't have the high mountains. It has a largely, a flat landscape, and yet it has, more species perhaps than you would think, given your explanations of speciation. So I just wondered whether you thought about that region and whether much of the speciation hasn't, like you were saying, it's individual, but it also in this part of the world must be driven by something else entirely, which might be the formation of the Maluku and Indonesia. I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, so I think is so the whole thing here in Australia and Australasia, of course, has a lot. Is you hearing me, or yeah, you hear me? Yes.
Yeah. she hears you.
Yes, I can hear you, no problem.
So I think some of the patterns are very different from South America, but I think that most of this endemism, that deep endemism of endemic families, for example, comes to the fact that both South America and Australia been island continents for many, many millions of years. And that's actually the two only continents that have been like this for so long. So that's why they come into so much special things as opposed to the rest of of Asia or North America as being joined by the whole Palearctic region. So, but then you have all these, I mean, if we have rivers and mountains in South America, you have islands here which work just as well or even better. So I think all these patterns in the Malay Archipelago and Papua New Guinea, I mean, that's just how amazing this region is.
Yeah, so it's Wallace again.
Thank you, Luciano. I very much enjoyed your talk. It was very comprehensive. So when you were talking about your species pairs and you were showing that in some places the diversification times differed, and then you just very briefly mentioned, oh, this has to do with mobility. Potentially mobility, and that's obviously something that I'm really interested in. And I was wondering if you might want to just mention that a bit more.
So that's one of the things that obviously people start asking me when I present about the birds and the rivers. Well, birds fly, right? Well, some of them do. So we had some nice, I didn't have enough time to present, but we have done some experiments, some flying experiments. So we're catching birds on the coast, under flooded forest, on terra firma forest, go to a river and release birds about 100, 200, and 400 meters to the coast. So these dispersal challenges. This has been done before. Was one study done in Panama. You did in Panama, and then we repeated in the Amazon with way more, like 80 species of birds, about 500 releases that we've done. And what we found was about 30%, 35% of the bird species could not fly 100 meters, right? They will go up. For those of you who are concerned with the birds, we'll go with the boat and catch the bird, release it back in the shore. Everybody was fine. But it was just, so many of the unbirds, for example, are not able to cross these rivers. However, there is not a very clear relationship between speciation process and dispersal capacity or flying capacity. For example, the wood creepers, many of the wood creepers separate neatly across different rivers, different subspecies, different species, yet they're very good flyers. So they will fly straight to the shore. So, so there is that, but we have to include those things in the models if we want to understand. Maybe there's something, it's not simple as that, just, oh, the good flyers, toucans can be divided across rivers. And of course, like parrot, different species of parrots, they could fly, But then comes the idea of a secondary contact and a secondary barrier. So birds actually out-compete one another. So they don't like to have their neighbor coming from the other side of the river, just will kick it out or not. Just doesn't happen. So competition, I guess.
Interesting. I might just ask, oh, sorry, one quick question here. Yep.
Don't laugh at me if I misunderstood the dead leaf bird that presumably eats dead leaves
No, it's
Oh.
going after insects, which are
on
in
the,
the dead leaves.
on the dead leaves.
Yeah.
Because I thought that's got to be a really boring diet. that explains it better. Thank you.
I just have one quick one. The Watson is such a weird bird. What is it related to? You said it came from Africa on a raft or
Yeah,
something?
so that's a long branch of, I mean, it's been jumping around its closest relatives, every phylogeny just keeps on showing, oh, it's related to this, oh, it's related to that. I don't remember exactly where it comes out, but it's a very long branch.
But what's it related to? Does anybody know? I mean, it's some African group then?
Well, no, there is nothing close to it. I don't remember exactly where. I mean, we can open a phylogeny and check where's the close, but it's nothing very close to it.
Right. Okay.
Like for example, what's it called, the New Caledonian thing. The cargo, the closest relative today is in South America, the sunbeater.
Right.
But then you can imagine extinctions throughout the,
Right. A rich and complicated story. Thank you very much, Luciano. That was one of the best sort of broad overview lectures that we've had in a long time. And you really brought a lot of your work into that. So your research. So really nicely done. And thanks very much. Appreciate it.